Our nation, as it always has, is counting on you to energize, to organize, and to mobilize, to register folks to vote, to get them to the polls, and to continue to fight for the future our nation and her people deserve.
That was Vice President Kamala Harris speaking to members of the Zeta Phi Beta sorority incorporated this week in Indianapolis. Harris's candidacy has quickly galvanized a massive network of black women who have long been the backbone of the Democratic Party. Just hours after President Biden endorsed Harris, 44,000 black women joined a Zoom call to support the vice president. That call sparked a trend, with thousands of black men on a call earlier this week as well, followed by Zooms for white women, LGBTQ supporters, South Asian supporters, and a whole lot more. New York Attorney General Letitia James joins us now. Welcome.
Madam Attorney General, thank you for being with us this morning. There has been a lot of talk about this call that happened last week, the Win with Black Women call, and I should note it is a call that actually has happened every Sunday for the past couple of years, but last Sunday was very specific. Can you give us some insight on what went down on the call?
I did send it out to my network of friends here in the great state of New York. It's really critically important that individuals understand what is at stake right now, and everything is at stake. As the Attorney General of the great state of New York, I and my other colleagues, all Democratic Attorney Generals, have endorsed Kamala Harris for President of these United States. And I think an Attorney General obviously knows, is in the best position to know what a former Attorney General is capable of. And Kamala Harris clearly is capable and is the most qualified individual to run for president. In fact, more qualified than the last 4 presidents. And it's important that individuals recognize that our basic liberties and freedoms right now are being jeopardized. As the Attorney General of the state of New York, I've joined with others to analyze Project 2025. And this is not something which is new to us. This is something which Donald Trump is true to. Why? Because when he was president of these United States, I and other attorney generals, Democratic attorney generals, we had to sue him. In fact, under my leadership, my office sued Donald Trump over 100 times. And the basis of all of that was Project 2025. So he cannot distance himself from something that he has attempted to implement when he was president of these United States. And we were successful 70% of the time. We were the firewall, Democratic attorney generals. And she, Kamala Harris, given her experience, given her background, given someone obviously who was concerned about liberty and freedoms in this country and our democracy as a whole, she is the most qualified candidate to be president of these United States. And it is my singular focus to have her elected as president of these United States, organizing, mobilizing, and educating individuals about all that Donald Trump did to this country, to divide us based on artificial constructs such as race and class and gender. As Eleanor Roosevelt once said, I believe because we are in a post-Roe world, that it is up to the women. And that's why individuals obviously need to step up, get people registered to vote, particularly in battleground states, and get out the vote in November.
General James, you touched on Project 2025, which we here on the weekend have put a great deal of emphasis on going back a number of months. And I really do appreciate you putting that in the context of the job you're currently doing. Could you flesh that out just a little bit more? Because I think people really don't appreciate exactly how Project 2025 is designed to change their constitutional liberties, their rights, and their freedoms, and how that limits access to opportunities as opposed to expanding it, which is some of what you were talking about.
So when Donald Trump was the president of these United States, he attempted to basically change the legal landscape here in these United States. And Democratic attorney generals, we sued him over and over and over again. And as I mentioned, we were successful 70% of the time. You know, under the leadership of President Biden, and I thank him for being this humble man who's this selfless man who put country before his own personal ambition. You know, he is the one that has put put in place legal pathways for migrants to come to this country. And it's important that individuals recognize that individuals are fleeing these countries under authoritarian rule because they want freedom. Freedom. And that's what we offer in this country. Freedom. And that's what's under a threat right now. Freedom. It's important to know that, again, when President Trump was in office, he attempted to address reproductive rights. We are now in a post-Roe world where literally women are bleeding out in bathrooms in order to get reproductive care. I went to Texas. I heard the stories of individuals who have had ectopic pregnancies, miscarriages, women who were raped and could not get reproductive care. And the only time that they can get emergency care is when their husbands found them bled out on bathroom floors. These are women who wanted to have children. You have a former president who basically wants to take universal lunch away from children. You have a president who wants to separate families. You have a president, obviously, who wants to, in the state of New York, we no longer have state and local tax exemptions, which impacts working people. You have a president of these United States, and Kamala Harris knows it well, who basically wants to go after unions, which are the reason why we have a middle class. Individuals, obviously, who have been the victims of wage theft. I and other Democratic attorney generals stand up for the rule of law in this country. And Kamala Harris, who was once the attorney general, once a district attorney, who went after criminals, someone who was the former United States Senate, who served on the Homeland and Security Committee, who has met with leaders all across this nation and who's traveled the globe. She is the most qualified candidate. And as a Democratic attorney general, joining with others, we have challenged Donald Trump, who basically wants to dismantle our country, wants to separate us based on race and gender, who says vile things, and who obviously is someone who does not respect the rule of law and does not respect the liberties that you and I enjoy and the freedoms, which is the basis of our democracy in this country. And that's why, given all that I have seen, the damage that he has attempted to do, it is really critically important that individuals stand up and walk in defiance to all that he represents and vote for the most qualified candidate, Vice President Kamala Harris, who will be the next president of these United States.
General James, you know, as we were talking in the last block about just the way in which Donald Trump attacks those that he views as his opponents or that are trying to hold him accountable that he doesn't agree with, he specifically has gone at, he has a specific ire, I feel like, when it comes to certain individuals. And you are one of the people that he has also attacked over the course for attempting to, and successfully in many respects, holding him accountable. I do want to ask you about one of those things. Donald Trump has an appeal given the Supreme Court ruling that essentially says, I guess, that, you know, presidents and former presidents are kings. It's an immunity ruling, if you will, that there's absolute immunity for official acts and presumptive immunity for some connected acts, no immunity for unofficial acts for a president. Donald Trump is appealing your particular ruling, and the spokesperson for your office said in a statement that there's nothing new in Donald Trump's appeal arguments. The defendants are raising arguments that we're already sanctioned and fined for. We won this case based on the facts and law, and we are confident we will prevail on appeal. Are you concerned that, given just the makeup of some of the courts in this country, particularly the Supreme Court, that there is a chance for him to skirt some of the accountability that your office has attempted to bring?
This is a state case. Last week, he perfected his appeal, and we are confident that in the state of New York, that we will recover over $450 million for the residents of the great state of New York. He's engaged in name calling. But unfortunately, the reality is that I will not dignify his comments. And two, I will not amplify his racism and or sexism. We've got to focus on issues. Americans are struggling right now. Inflation has gone down, again, under the leadership of President Biden. Right now, we are experiencing one of the lowest unemployment rates in history. And it's really critically important that the number of illegal border crossings has come to one of the lowest points, again, because of pathways that President Biden and Vice President Harris have created through executive order that Republicans oppose. We had an opportunity to create bipartisan immigration, but unfortunately, Donald Trump killed it for political purposes. I will not fear Donald Trump. I have steel in my backbone. And the reality is I will not allow this person, Donald Trump, who unfortunately is a broken man, to get in the way of progress and to separate us. It's important that Americans understand that we need to stand up and defend our liberties, our rights. And the reason why countless number of individuals are flocking to this country is because of our liberties and freedoms, which are under attack from individuals led by Donald Trump, who only want to attack us based on grievances. And a number of those grievances are issues that we have addressed in court as Democratic attorney generals, and they're all laid out in Project 2025. Individuals need to understand that they should not vote against their economic interests, and that people need to stand up. We also need to recognize that Kamala Harris has been a great defender of unions and working class people in this country. And as a proud defender of unions, it's important that individuals understand that we need to grow out the middle class, and we need to hear from young people. Right now, she is leading the polls for young people by 20 points. Because young people are sick and tired of the racism, sexism. They're tired, apparently, of the grievances. They want a functioning government. And right now you have Republicans in Congress, which is paralyzed under their leadership. We need to move this country forward, and we need to make progress for all Americans and not engage, unfortunately, in name calling. Kamala Harris represents the future, and that's why this attorney general and all Democratic attorney generals are supporting, endorsing, holding up, and making sure that Kamala Harris is the next president of these United States.